Greg, in your new book, Freedom from Speech, which you characterize as a broadside, you write, while the First Amendment protects freedom of speech and freedom of the press as they relate to duties of the state and state power, freedom of speech is a far broader idea that includes additional cultural values. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm a First Amendment lawyer. I'm specialized in First Amendment law, but I'm amazed at how many times people think that the First Amendment and free speech are the same thing. The First Amendment's a wonderful manifestation of our founding fathers' respect for freedom of speech, but the cultural idea of freedom of speech is this idea that we hear each other out, that we debate, that we discuss, that we deal with the fact that people fundamentally disagree on different issues, that we give the benefit of the doubt.
And we have tolerance for a little bit of disagreement.
And that we have tolerance for disagreement. And my point in freedom from speech is, one, to talk about how I see this as a much bigger global problem, about how I believe that a lot of Americans don't understand how bad the situation is for freedom of speech abroad, and how increasingly, I think not just on our campuses, but in our larger societies, people not only do, but they're going to increasingly expect not so much freedom of speech, but freedom from speech they dislike.
They want protections. As an example of things that have gone wrong right here at home, you write the following: the public's appetite for punishing attempts at candor gone wrong, drunken rants, or even private statements made in anger or frustration seems to be growing at an alarming rate. Give us some examples.
Absolutely. I mean, it comes from the fact that I confess I actually do watch CNN. I think I might be the last remaining viewer of that network. But it seems like every single day, or certainly every week, one of the top stories is, person X said something that was offensive. And it seems like the bar for what you have to say to be offensive is also getting lower and lower. So, on the sort of high offensive end, you have someone like Donald Sterling. And what he said was genuine, fit the term racist. It was a genuinely racist statement. But the only thing that was really disturbing about that case was that it was recorded in his own home.
He was eavesdropped on in a private conversation.
Yeah, and that's creepy, and that should creep people out. And I think most thoughtful people do have that pause over that. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have the Brendan Ike case. And for those of you who don't remember, Brendan Ike was the president of Mozilla, a big internet company. And he gave just $1,000 back in 2008 to Prop 8, the petition in California, which was the anti-gay marriage proposition. And for that, when this got out, and I always have to remind people, back in 2008, this was nowhere near a majority of Americans were pro-gay marriage.
Well, I think mainstream, and even President Obama at the time was not supportive of gay marriage.
And Hillary Clinton. I mean, it was not considered a politically tenable position. And when this got out, there was a big clamor for him to be fired. And in the face of that, the company asked him to step down, and he stepped down. And the one good thing that came out of that was there were a number of gay rights advocates, including my friend Jonathan Rauch.
Yes, we've had him on the show. He's wonderful.
Oh, he's amazing. Who wrote this great letter saying, listen, this is not what we were fighting for. We were not fighting for a society where people who disagree with us have to quit their jobs. But unfortunately, what I think we're heading into, what Rauch is trying to fight, and what I'm trying to fight, is this a kind of idea that genuine sort of opinion pluralism, genuine differences, genuine sort of different ways of expressing yourself, different religious beliefs, should only be tolerated in the most technical sense.
And where are these voices of intolerance coming from, and what magnifies them?
Well, it's interesting because I work on campuses and I fight campus censorship, but my message in freedom from speech is much bigger than that. I think as societies become more comfortable, as they become more affluent, as it's easier for you to switch on a radio station or switch on a TV program or TV channel where you can totally hear your opinion regurgitated to you, when you can take more antidepressants and you can take more pain pills, that people increasingly, I think there's a natural human tendency to, one, want physical comfort, but then to a degree to want also intellectual comfort. You don't want to be challenged. You don't want to disagree. It's nicer when everybody agrees with you and tells you how smart you are.
Yeah, all you get is self-affirmation, and you don't have to deal with questioning your own beliefs.
Exactly. So the intellectual process that is good for you is actually more difficult. So it makes sense that to a degree this is always sort of under assault. And as everything else gets better, and certainly scientifically, I think we are headed in a very positive direction in a lot of different ways. This is a category of problem that I believe is actually going to get worse. As people get more comfortable, they're going to want greater freedom from speech.
And it seems to be a lot easier to gather a mob on social media today than it was in the streets of Salem when they were going after witches.
It certainly does. The Twitter mobbing, the ability for people just to rile people up over, and in some cases, I mean, the Stephen Colbert case, which I'd also talk about.
Tell us about that for those who haven't heard it.
It's just amazing. Okay, so Stephen Colbert makes a joke on his show, making fun of the Redskins owner for starting up a charity that was called something like the Fund for the Original Americans, which basically, like, Stephen Colbert, the comedian, thought it was sort of insensitive, so he made a joke about some offensively named Asian charity that he just started out that was, kind of...
As an analogy.
Yeah. The joke itself was picking on someone for being insensitive. But when that got retweeted, there was suddenly this call by a number of activists.
Off with his head.
Off with his head. And there was the Cancel Colbert hashtag going all through the world. Now, for me, this was almost a welcome development.
Right.
Because I want people to see the stuff that I'm seeing every day.
Well, why do people kowtow to the mob? I mean, why didn't Mozilla tell them to go pound sand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're not, my position is that we're not taught these principles very well. I think even First Amendment advocates, even free speech advocates, don't understand the depth and profound philosophy behind freedom of speech, behind pluralism.
Speaking of philosophy, in your book, you raise the issue of epistemic humility.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Epistemic humility is an overly fancy way of saying that one of the most profound discoveries in I think, human thought is that we can't know everything. And to the extent to which everyone goes, oh, we all know that. Not really.
Yeah.
I think we're always tempted by the idea that, ancient philosophers to ones today, that we can actually know everything. We can't. The entire Enlightenment system had this wonderful respect for the limits of human knowledge.
Well, there's the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. It's three categories.
Exactly. And John Locke's entire, the system of government he came up with was predicated on these limits of human knowledge. But you wouldn't know that if you look at the way we argue as a society. Everyone is coming forward with this, cocksure certainty that we're absolutely right on every political opinion we have, without ever going, there are actually probably limits to what I can know.
Do you think this increased dogmatism is related to the higher degree of polarization we're experiencing politically?
I think they feed off of each other. And I even talk about, I wrote an earlier book called Unlearning Liberty that talks about polarization. And just like I think, the push for freedom from speech is at least in part a development of otherwise positive things, I think the same thing of polarization. There's a great book called The Big Sort, written by a journalist named Bill Bishop. And he talks about how, in the 1970s, there was this guy, Ronald Engelhart, saying, this future is going to be awesome. We're going to be able to live in communities that increasingly share our values and talk among people who share our values, and it's going to be great. Well, we live in that society, and there are great aspects of it. And we are increasingly clustering right down to the blocks we live on more politically homogeneous than we were 20, 30 years ago. And that's, there's a positive aspect to that. But the downside is it leads to people thinking that any right person thinks exactly like them.
Yeah, everybody on the Upper West Side, is shocked when people disagree with them.
Oh, my God, are they?
I want to move on to your mission on campus, and you made one comment that I thought was quite interesting in your book, where you said it was only a matter of time before the cultivation of bad intellectual habits on campus started harming the dialogue of our entire country.
Yep.
Has that point come?
I definitely think it has, because when you look at sort of the postmodern tools for sort of cheaply winning arguments that were sort of weaponized on campuses, starting as early as possibly the 60s, but certainly were in big use by the 80s and 90s. Well, the idea of, just completely dismissing people's point of view, making the argument that you're offended and that there's no way to rationally address how someone feels.
Right.
If you feel something, there's no counter argument to it, and basically that means that to a degree you're always wrong. And the thing that's amazing about this argument, about this approach to arguing, is it shuts down the process of discussion, and it tends to lean in favor of what the dominant opinion, on campus is. And you look at the way we debate in the media, and you've got all these people, for the most part, coming from relatively fancy schools, and they engage in this sort of series of dog whistles and fallbacks.
Yeah, ad hominem attacks, and don't listen to him. The Koch brothers paid his bills. It's right.
Ad hominem attacks, but also falling back on how dare you arguments, which are arguments that, in the 19th century, you had people like John Stuart Mill going, how much substance really is there to the, oh, I'm offended, so
Yeah,
what?
blasphemy,
Are you
blasphemy.
right?
Yeah. So you are the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which I understand was founded by our friend Harvey Silverglate and Professor Alan Charles back in '99.
Yeah.
We've had Harvey on the show. He's a civil liberties attorney of some renown.
Yep.
When did you take over there?
Well, I've been with FIRE since it was about a year and a half old. I came on as the first director of legal and public advocacy. So for the nice first chunk of my time at FIRE, I was the legal director. It was great. I'm a constitutional law specialized lawyer. I loved it.
And what's the mission?
The mission is to defend due process and freedom of speech, academic freedom, religious liberty, all the basic rights, but applied to college campuses.
And defend it against who?
For the most part, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote Freedom from Speech. For most of my career, we've been defending it against out-of-control administrators who sometimes are ideologues, sometimes they just want to push people around, sometimes they've got too much power and abuse it. And that's been most of my career. The reason why I wrote Freedom from Speech is that increasingly, at least over the last year, it hasn't been the administrators calling for censorship as much as that's been students themselves.
Really?
Yeah. And that is distressing to me on a major level because I like defending students. I've devoted my career to defending the free speech rights of students. And so when I go on, once again to bring up CNN, when I go on CNN and I find I'm actually debating a student on whether or not someone should be allowed to speak on their campus, there's something sort of profoundly sad about that to me, and of course worrisome for the future.
Well, who molded their character and their thoughts that they'd behave that way?
It starts as early as K through 12. Like I think that kindergarten on up really does go with this argument that never hurt anyone's feelings, sort of conform to what the political beliefs are of the group, and so it's pretty bad by the time they get to college. But it does seem to get even worse when people arrive there. Aren't
college kids supposed to rebel against conformity, not enforce it?
You would think that, and I think there is a degree of that. There's just not enough. I think that the tools that K through 12 and universities have learned to use are very effective, in part because they play to sympathy. They play to kindness. They basically think, how can you dissent with our political position on the following 15 issues? Only a mean, cruel, unkind person would do that.
Yeah, you call that the care ethic.
The care ethic, yes. And that's a term I borrowed from Jonathan Haidt, who is an author who I'm a big fan of, and I'm actually working on a piece with him right now. And he wrote this great book called The Righteous Mind, in which he talks about the foundations of morality. And he comes up with a fairly controversial theory that when you look at world cultures, most of them have sort of multiple points of how they define their morality that include things like whether or not something is a caring action or whether or not something conforms to people's ideas of sacredness, or loyalty or relationship with authority or fighting for liberty. That he comes up with these 6 different moral ideas that seem to unite cultures all over the world. But he makes the point that the American left, the people on sort of like the left side of the spectrum, tend to really emphasize one point almost to the exclusion of all others, which is the care for perceived victims.
Well, it's a victimology approach to politics in general.
Right. And, and there's something to be said for that, as long as it's not allowed to be the only point in your moral calculation. And it leads to this situation where kind of like no matter what you do to protect people, as long as you can say that I'm the good person and those are the people that need protecting, you can do it even if it doesn't make a great deal of rational sense. So in Freedom from Speech, I talk a lot about this mentality arising from this sort of unbound care ethic.
Talk to us about the explosion of trigger warnings on campus.
Yeah. Trigger warnings were precisely what I was thinking about when I was talking about the unbound care ethic. Because trigger warnings, they were this mechanism that people initially came up with on websites that were primarily for victims of things like sexual assault. And I think this was, initially a compassionate, even sensible thing to do, to say, listen, if you're really traumatized, you might not want to read this article because I'm going to go into detail about my experiences being assaulted. And that makes a good deal of sense. But the problem is, once it started on the Internet, it began being expanded to these huge and sometimes absurd lists of things that you have to put trigger warnings in front of. Discussions of patriarchy, discussions of colonialism, discussions of ableism or fat shaming. You're expected to put a trigger warning on this. And this became so absurd that by 2012, you even had feminist website saying, these things are dead. They've become ridiculous. They've become a joke. Let's get rid of them. So this is way back in 2012.
What's the downside? So you put a trigger warning in. Every professor stands up and says, hi, good morning, here's my trigger warning. If you don't like my class, go home. And then he gives this lecture.
There's a philosophical problem with it. And one is that it tells students that they are essentially victims. That essentially
they're training them.
That if you've been hurt, if you've been wounded, it's over for you. The only thing we can now do is protect you from the world because you are never, ever going to be okay again. And that is a completely anti-psychological, anti-science. That is not what people who deal with PTSD want the world to look like.
But it's a great way to create a base of voters.
It is. It is. And meanwhile, there's the practical problem, which is that it's an impossible expectation. A professor cannot guess how many things that not only a student will genuinely feel traumatized by, but how many things an administrator or a student might claim to feel traumatized by. And so what's happening already, and the latest push for trigger warnings on campus has only really been going for a good 6 to 8 months at campuses like Oberlin and UC Santa Barbara and Rutgers. But in that time, professors are already writing articles saying, we are getting complaints from students, from administrators, from faculty, and we believe our jobs are in danger because we can't put enough trigger warnings on stuff to make sure that everybody's feelings are protected. This is it's a formula for getting every single professor in the country fired, or for dumbing down the curricula so much that they don't deal with adult subjects.
How could a tenured professor get fired?
Well, I've seen it, but it's also important to understand that tenured professors are only a relatively tiny portion.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of instructors and lecturers.
Yeah.
So every spring when commencement comes around, there seems to be a larger and larger raft of campus speakers that are unceremoniously disinvited from coming and giving a graduation lecture. What's going on there?
Yeah, this is funny. And within FIRE, we've noticed this sort of ramping up of trying to get speakers disinvited every spring for years now. And it used to be kind of a joke within FIRE that we call this, it's disinvitation season. But then it got so much worse every year that it kind of ceased being funny. Because, how are you supposed to have a marketplace of ideas if you're saying that people who have ideas we don't like can't even speak on campus? And there are two things I want to be clear about this invitation season with. It does last all year. It only gets more intense around convocation.
It gets a lot of press.
And we also make the point that it's not so much that universities will consistently actually formally disinvite people, but that students are increasingly demanding that people be disinvited. And to us, that's the real bad statement. The idea that they don't say, like a previous generation, and I talk about this. I graduated from college in 1996. We were hardly sort of like the picture of Rhodes Scholars, of academic virtue. But we did at least understand that the people who were coming to speak at convocations, to come and speak at our university, we might not agree with them, but they might be worth hearing out. That idea seems to have fallen entirely by the wayside.
Well, it even seems that giving away copies of the Constitution is being disinvited. I have a hard time imagining what the rationale is for that.
The Constitution. This is something that I cannot.
It's a subversive document or something?
Over the last year, we have had 2 different cases where students have been told that they cannot hand out copies of the Constitution on campus without getting advanced state permission, without going to the tiny free speech zone. We had an additional case where students were told that they could not hand out a petition against NSA spying on campus outside of the free speech zone, outside of getting advanced state permission. I mean, how Orwellian can you get? You can't protest the NSA without outside of the free speech zone.
Wow.
It's just almost beyond parody.
And this is tolerated by campus administrators.
This is propagated by campus administrators is the amazing thing.
Wow.
And what's funny is so it was 1 year ago, last Constitution Day, that a student was trying to hand out constitutions at Modesto Junior College. And he got this all on tape about the multiple attempts that they had to get him to stop handing it out and to get state permission and all this stuff. Meanwhile, we fought for another student, the one who was told he couldn't protest the NSA, at Citrus College. And he filed a lawsuit as part of this big litigation project we're doing. And we had video of him handing out constitutions this past Constitution Day. And lo and behold, the sky does not fall. It looks like a perfectly pleasant day.
Right. Students aren't traumatized by being exposed to the Constitution.
Exactly.
So colleges have not always been known as the most civil places. I was certainly there when there were protests in the streets. But we seem to have something called a heckler's veto now when it comes to invited speakers. What's that all about?
Well, heckler's veto, it has been around for a long time. It just seems to be used more often. And what a heckler's veto means is that when you get together your group of people who don't want someone to speak on campus or in public, and you shout them down. You make it impossible for them to carry out their speech. In some cases, you throw bottles at them. It's a classic, example of what a heckler's veto looks like. Or, as happened at Brown University last fall, they invited the former commissioner of police, Ray Kelly, of New York City. Now, he's done some controversial things, including being the author of the Stop and Frisk program. Now, I'm a civil liberties guy, so I don't agree with Stop and Frisk. But because you disagree with something is all the more reason why you should hear that person
Hear the argument so you can find the flaws in it.
Yeah, exactly. And what Ray Kelly had done in the face of protesters was he had said, okay, listen, I know you got a lot of hard questions for me. I'm going to agree to an hour of question and answer after my speech because I know that people really want to ask me some tough questions. I'm doing it. I'm up for it.
Just hold it until then. What happened?
Well, what happened was he ended up going to give his speech at Brown, and students showed up, and they shouted him down, so much so that nobody could hear him. He tried to speak for half an hour, and they finally just had to give up.
And walked off.
And what's amazing to me is the students, in some cases, who were the most angry were those ones who weren't fans of Ray Kelly, but they were denied the opportunity to ask those hard questions.
So, Greg, this all sounds pretty pessimistic. I know you're working hard at FIRE to turn things around. Is there any hope for that?
Well, one thing that I try to do in freedom from speech is sometimes I think people think that the problem with free speech on campus and the problem with free speech globally is just some sort of temporary insanity of political correctness run amok, and
it'll pass.
We're just going to get over it. And the bad news, what I'm saying is, this is a much bigger and longer fight than I think people understand. The good news is that we already know the ways to fight it. And probably one of the most important ways to fight it is to instill rhetorical habits and intellectual habits into students. Hear the other side out. Debate and discussion. Tolerate pluralistic views. Always keep in mind you might be wrong. And while these are difficult skills to teach, the one reason why you should be somewhat optimistic is they work really well at finding out what is true and what is false, what's a good idea, what's a bad idea. So that's one of the great things about, sort of like the classically liberal intellectual system, is that it's really effective. And I think that the schools that do a better job of teaching that
will produce more effective students.